A rich man fires a black woman after getting her pregnant. 24 years later, a man walks into his office, shocking the entire company. Thank you for supporting our channel. There are many more captivating stories coming up at Mr. Wisdom Story. Subscribe to stay updated with the latest videos. Wishing you happiness and peace. Nia Scott stood facing Charles Henderson's desk, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms, a cold sweat covering her skin. The leather chair beneath her felt stiff and unwelcoming, and the unfamiliarity of the office only sharpened the anxiety coursing through her. Charles didn't look up when she entered, his eyes fixed on a stack of documents, his pen gliding across the paper as if the world beyond those numbers didn't exist. Every soft scratch of his pen felt like a stab to her chest, each stroke deepening the tension between them. Silence hung heavily in the air, dense and oppressive, until finally, Charles set his pen down, leaned back in his chair, and fixed her with a cool, detached stare, as if he already knew what was coming. "Nia," he said, his voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "This isn't about work, is it?" Her heart tightened, its rhythm pounding erratically. She had prepared for this moment over countless restless nights, but now, facing him, the words caught in her throat, dry and constricted. She swallowed, trying to steady herself. "No," she managed, her gaze dropping to her hands. I'm pregnant." A thick, suffocating silence settled over them. Charles remained still, his expression unreadable, as if she hadn't spoken at all, her words disappearing into the void between them. Time dragged on, stretching into an eternity, until he finally broke the silence with a detached tone. "I see." Just 3 words, delivered with chilling calm. Nia blinked, a sharp pang hitting her chest. "It's your child, Charles," she said, her voice thin, barely holding steady. "I thought you should know." Charles sighed, his face showing only a hollow disinterest. He leaned back, running a hand over his face before speaking again in that same detached tone, as though nothing of importance was unfolding. "Nia, this is unfortunate." "Unfortunate?" Her stomach twisted at the word. She'd anticipated a range of reactions, anger, shock, maybe even regret, but this apathy struck her like a blow she hadn't expected. "Is that all you have to say?" She looked up, her voice trembling with disappointment. "You should have been more careful," he replied flatly. The words slapped her harder than a physical blow. She drew a slow breath, her stomach churning. "We were careful." "Clearly, not careful enough," he said, his tone icy, like a knife slicing through her defenses. He leaned back, hands steepled on the desk. "So what do you expect me to do? Spell it out." Her throat tightened, her vision blurring slightly. She struggled to keep her breath steady, unable to believe how ruthless he had become. "I just thought you should know," she said quietly, her voice barely steady. "I thought we should figure this out together." Charles raised an eyebrow, his gaze hard, a mocking edge to his voice. "Figure it out? Nia, you know what this is. I have a family. I have a reputation. This was never anything more than a mistake between us. There's nothing to figure out." His words were like a punch to the gut, leaving her breathless. She thought of the countless late nights in this very office, his whispered promises in the dark, the moments she once thought meant something real. But to him, it had only ever been a game. Nia straightened, drawing in a breath, finding the last remnants of strength within her. "I'm keeping the baby, Charles," she said firmly, not because she felt strong, but because there was no other choice for her. He sighed again, stood, and circled his desk, stopping in front of her with that same frigid look. "I can't be involved. You know that." A chill seeped through her, as if nothing in the world could scare her more than the emptiness she saw in his eyes. "So, you're just going to walk away?" "Yes," he replied, his voice unyielding, without a flicker of doubt. "And you should do the same." Nia stood, her face flushed, anger flaring hot in her chest. I can't just walk away, Charles. This is your child, too. He held her gaze, his eyes sharp and cold as steel. Nia, he said, his jaw tightening, his voice unwavering, hear me clearly, let this go. I've done enough. If you turn this into a problem, you'll regret it. Her heart seemed to stop, shock freezing her in place. What are you saying? He turned back to his desk, easing into his chair as though returning to the comfort of a routine. His eyes hardened, his voice dismissive. I'm saying today is your last day at Henderson Enterprises. What? Her body trembled, unable to process his words. You're terminated, he continued, his tone level, as if discussing any other business transaction. The paperwork's already filed. You'll receive a severance package, but effective immediately, you're no longer an employee here. The words stung like a slap across her face. You're firing me, because I'm pregnant? Because of you? Her voice rose, breaking under the weight of fury and pain. I'm protecting my family, Nia. And you'd be wise to protect yourself, Charles said, his voice low, carrying a subtle threat. If you push this, I'll make sure you'll never work in this industry again. Her body shook as she fought to keep her composure, her eyes stinging. She looked at him, the man she had once trusted, now nothing more than a stranger, a cold, ruthless stranger. She swallowed hard, forcing down the tears that threatened to spill. I never thought you'd do this, she whispered, her voice thick. You shouldn't have thought anything else, he replied, his face blank, as though this were just another business deal. She didn't cry. She refused to give him that satisfaction. Silent, Nia turned, her steps stiff and heavy. She moved to her desk, each item she packed into her bag adding weight to her shoulders. As she stepped out of the elevator, Nia glanced at her reflection in the glass doors. Her tired eyes stared back at her, and behind that reflection was a heart shattering into pieces. She felt the weight of loss press down on her, each piece of herself splintering away, leaving nothing but emptiness and haze. In mere minutes, everything had disappeared, her job, her future, her career, everything she had poured herself into. Now, it wasn't just a job lost, it was her one chance to stand tall in this field. Out on the street, she felt like she was invisible in the bustling crowd, as if no one could see the truth breaking her apart. Then her hand brushed against her stomach, where a new life was quietly forming, and a warmth grew in her, steady and gentle, as if something still held her up, refusing to let her fall. She wasn't alone. She still had her child, and no matter what, she would get through this. Brandon stood before the mirror, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie for the 5th time. Every time he touched it, his muscles tightened, as if every nerve in his body was wired and on edge. He took a deep breath, trying to silence the jumble of thoughts in his head. From the kitchen, the sound of boiling water broke the silence, a sign that his mother was still preparing for the day. He felt a slight relief thinking about telling her about his first day at the new job. Just 5 more minutes before he had to leave, but first, he needed his mother's blessing. When he entered the kitchen, he found Nia already seated, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She looked up as he walked in, offering him a smile that fell short of the warmth he was hoping for. Something in that smile made him shiver. Mom, how do I look? Brandon turned, showing off his new suit with pride. First day at Henderson Enterprises, this is a big milestone, right? Nia looked at him, her hands tightening around the mug, her gaze lingering on the tea. She nodded. But the joy he expected was absent. Yes, Bran, it is a big milestone, she said, her voice soft, missing the excitement he'd hoped for. Brandon paused, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. Something was off. His mother couldn't possibly be anything but happy about such a major opportunity. Aren't you happy? He asked, moving closer and sitting across from her. You don't seem as excited as I thought you'd be. Nia lowered her head, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her tea. Her voice was faint. I am happy for you, I'm not sure about that place, she murmured, trying to mask the worry in her voice. What? Mom, Henderson Enterprises is one of the leading insurance firms in the country. This is huge for me, for our family, Brandon said, confused at his mother's concern. Nia sighed, her hands gripping the mug so tightly that her knuckles turned white, as if she was holding back something powerful. I know, but that place isn't what you think it is. I don't understand what you're saying. Brandon felt confusion mounting, worry filling his mind. Is there someone there you're worried about? Nia paused, her fingers still clutching the mug tightly, the color drained from her knuckles. She just shook her head, her gaze fixed on the tea, as though she couldn't bring herself to say anything more. It's not that, she replied, her voice choked, as though there was something she couldn't bring herself to reveal. Brandon leaned back, feeling tension thickening in the air between them, as if he was being pulled into an overwhelming wave. His mother had always been his greatest supporter, always encouraging him, always believing in his decisions. But now, she was so worried. Be careful? A pang of frustration rose in his chest. Mom, this is what we've been waiting for all these years. I've worked hard, sacrificed for years, and now you're worried? Nia looked up, her eyes filled with worry, her face shadowed with a hint of fear. But not everything is what it seems. I don't understand what you're saying. Brandon sat up straighter, moving closer. You were happy when I told you about this job. Nia hesitated, her eyes a mixture of pain and worry. Time seemed to stretch between them, each second making the tension thicker. Brandon felt the weight of the moment. He couldn't understand what had changed. I don't want you to get hurt, Nia finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Some places have hidden things you don't see until it's too late. Brandon frowned, unable to grasp what she was hinting at. Hidden things? Mom, it's just a job, an opportunity. I'm not a child who'd fall into some trap. This is going to help us, help you. Nia gave a small nod, but her face held an unease that wouldn't fade. Just promise me you'll be careful, Bran. The gentleness in her words softened something deep within Brandon. He felt an overwhelming pull, a feeling he couldn't deny. I promise I'll be careful. But you have to trust me, Mom. I've worked so hard to get this opportunity, and I won't let anything ruin it. Nia nodded, though the worry in her eyes still lingered. I do trust you, Bran. I always have. Brandon glanced at his watch, then stood up, giving her shoulder a light pat. I need to go now. I'll call you later, okay? Nia smiled, though it was a tired, almost strained smile, as if it took some of her strength to manage it. Good luck, my love. Brandon leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead before grabbing his briefcase and heading for the door. But just before he left, he turned back for a final glance. She was still sitting there, her gaze heavy as she stared into her tea, silent. For the first time in his life, he felt a vague sense of unease, a shadow of doubt creeping into his mind. But he shook it off quickly, nothing would stand in his way. This was his chance, and nothing could stop him. The subway ride downtown felt like standing on the edge of a new life. Everything around him bustled with urgency, but in that moment, Brandon was focused on only one thing, the beginning of something monumental. Gripping the handrail tightly, his mind buzzed with a flurry of thoughts. This was the pinnacle he had dreamed of, the product of years of relentless effort. He wouldn't let his mother's vague warnings distract him. Henderson Enterprises, one of the biggest names in insurance. Not everyone got a spot here. He had beaten out hundreds of applicants to be here, so there was no reason to doubt himself now. His mother's worry was probably just nerves, her fear of such a big change. Once the dust settled, he'd talk it over with her. As he stepped out of the subway station, Brandon couldn't resist lifting his head to take in the sight of the Henderson Enterprises Tower. The building rose above him, its glassy exterior gleaming in the sunlight, almost dreamlike. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders and strode forward, excitement brimming within him. This was where it would all begin. Inside the lobby, the air buzzed with energy, employees in suits moved briskly, focused on their tasks. Brandon checked in with the receptionist, and minutes later, a stern woman with sharp eyes, Ms. Taylor, led him up to the office. "Welcome, Brandon," Ms. Taylor said as they stepped into the elevator, her tone cool but not devoid of expectation. "We have high hopes for you." "Thank you, ma'am," Brandon replied, feeling his nervousness morph into determination, ready to face the challenges ahead. As they passed through each floor, Brandon felt the palpable intensity of the company. Everything here was perfect, sleek, but also charged with an undeniable tension. Everyone was absorbed in their work, rarely glancing up as he walked by. Yet, he didn't feel out of place, rather, he felt a certainty settle over him. This was where he would prove himself. As they passed a conference room, Brandon caught a glimpse of Charles Henderson, the company's CEO, in conversation with a group of senior executives. Brandon felt a rush of admiration rise within him. Charles Henderson, the man who had built this company from the ground up, the figure he'd long looked up to. But as Charles's eyes met his for a brief second, Brandon felt an inexplicable sensation stir inside him. In that fleeting moment, as their gazes crossed, there was a flicker of something in Charles's expression, a trace of recognition, a shadow that flitted by, making it hard for Brandon to look away. Charles turned back to his conversation without acknowledging him further, and Brandon forced himself to brush off the odd feeling, though a lump lingered in his throat. He couldn't understand, why would Charles Henderson recognize him? He was just a newcomer, another face among the fresh recruits. Perhaps he was just imagining it. Either way, it didn't matter. He was one of hundreds of new hires. As Ms. Taylor led him to his desk, Brandon focused on his work, clenching his jaw slightly as he accepted his first assignment. A surge of excitement and determination gripped him, his fingers itching to dive into the task. He was ready to prove he wasn't just some anonymous newcomer. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, his mother's words echoed in his mind. "Some places have shadows, Brandon, things you won't see until it's too late." He shook his head, forcing the thoughts aside. He was here to succeed, not to worry. Everything would be fine, his mother might have her concerns, but he wouldn't let any shadows stand in his way. This was his moment. The workspace buzzed with activity, keyboards clattered, conversations hummed across the open floor. Brandon sat at his new desk, fingers moving swiftly over the keys as he navigated the documents Ms. Taylor had handed him. The reports were thick, dense, but he pored over them, determined to make a strong first impression. Yet, despite his focus, he couldn't shake the image of Charles Henderson's gaze from his mind. That flash of recognition in Charles's eyes puzzled him, a brief look that refused to fade. Brandon rubbed his temples, a faint prickle of unease lingering as he replayed the moment. It didn't make sense. Why would Charles Henderson know him? He was just one of hundreds of new hires. Maybe it was just first-day jitters. Brandon had always had a tendency to overthink when a big opportunity was on the horizon. He needed to focus, to prove himself, to show the higher-ups he deserved to be here. Lunch break came and went, but Brandon barely left his seat, eating a quick sandwich at his desk, unwilling to waste a single minute. He'd heard stories about Henderson Enterprises, about the fierce competition, about how every employee was measured by their productivity and efficiency. He couldn't afford to fall behind, especially not on his first day. His eyes began to ache from the dense text of the reports, but he powered through, determined to make a good impression. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, an inexplicable feeling of unease continued to settle around him. It wasn't just the look Charles had given him earlier, it was something more, a faint, lurking sense of something unseen, as if a shadow loomed just below the surface, beyond his understanding. When Ms. Taylor came by to check his progress, a hint of tension tightened in his chest, unbidden and stubborn. "You're doing well, Brandon," she said, her tone dry but edged with a touch of approval as her eyes flicked over his computer screen. "Your work pace is impressive." Brandon managed a polite smile, though his pulse quickened beneath his calm exterior. "Thank you," he replied, stretching slightly, fighting to stay composed. "Just trying to keep up." "You're doing well. Keep it up." Ms. Taylor turned to leave, but paused, her face growing serious, a shift that made Brandon's stomach tighten. "Oh, I almost forgot. Mr. Henderson wants to see you in his office." A jolt shot through Brandon. Charles Henderson, the name he'd only heard with awe and respect, now asking to meet him on his very first day? "Mr. Henderson? Are you sure?" He tried to contain the surprise in his voice, but couldn't quite mask the hint of confusion. Ms. Taylor offered no further explanation, simply nodding toward the elevator. "He's on the 40th floor. You can head up now." Brandon's heart thudded as his mind raced. Why would Charles Henderson call for him? As a new hire, he'd never expected the CEO would summon him to his office so soon. Rising from his chair, he felt his jacket grow slightly constrictive around his shoulders, and his palms were damp. Was this a good sign? A welcoming gesture? Or was something else waiting for him on the other side? Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he headed toward the elevator. The sounds around him seemed to fade, leaving only the steady rhythm of his footsteps, each one leading him closer to a place filled with unknowns. When the elevator doors opened on the 40th floor, Brandon stepped into a space that felt worlds apart from the bustling lower floors. The executive floor exuded luxury, a hushed weightiness filled the air. Floor-to-ceiling windows allowed the late afternoon light to pour in, bathing everything in a warm glow. Surrounded by such an expanse, he felt almost small, like a grain of sand lost in a vast ocean. Brandon walked up to the reception desk, trying to ignore the knot tightening in his stomach. Each step felt heavier than the last, but he kept his face steady, his voice clear, despite the tension building in his chest. "I'm here to see Mr. Henderson, Brandon Grant," he said, forcing his voice to sound firm, even as his fingers clenched tightly around the handle of his briefcase. The receptionist, a woman with a warm smile and flawless appearance, gestured toward the large wooden door behind her. "He's expecting you. Go right in." Brandon nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease spreading inside him. His body felt taut, as if he was bracing against something. He moved toward the door, his hand trembling slightly as it rested on the handle. A wave of apprehension rose within him, coiling tight in his chest. Taking a slow, deep breath, he turned the handle and opened the door. Charles Henderson's office was expansive, with sweeping views of the city that made Brandon feel small. Every detail in the room spoke of power, the grand wooden desk, the luxurious leather chairs. Charles sat behind the desk, his back to the window, not bothering to look up right away. For a brief moment, Brandon stood still, his feet seemingly rooted to the ground as each second dragged on. He felt his breath catch, the air thick around him. Finally, Charles raised his head, his expression unreadable, eyes cold. "Brandon, come in. Have a seat." Brandon stepped forward, unable to look away from Charles. The man's gaze seemed to pierce right through him, as though he were searching for something hidden, something intangible. Brandon felt his chest tighten, an unsettling feeling taking hold, as though the room itself was bearing down on him, trapping him. "Is there something specific you wanted to discuss with me, Mr. Henderson?" he asked, his voice catching slightly, the tension evident in each word. Charles's expression didn't change. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving Brandon's face. "You're new here, Brandon, just starting out, yet your name caught my attention." A jolt ran through Brandon, his heart hammering, his throat tightening. My name? Charles narrowed his eyes, as if drawing on some distant memory. After a moment's silence, he leaned forward, an almost imperceptible shift that made Brandon feel the weight of his presence even more. Grant, isn't it? Brandon nodded slowly, his pulse racing. Yes, sir. Brandon Grant. Charles studied him for a long moment, his sharp gaze making Brandon feel as though he were on the verge of unraveling. It's a strong name, Charles finally said, his voice laced with a hint of something Brandon couldn't identify. Reminds me of someone I once knew. The entire room seemed to freeze. Charles's words echoed like stones dropped into a still lake, each one sending out ripples Brandon couldn't quite understand. The tension was thick, a heaviness weighing down every word. Charles didn't elaborate, just gave a faint, closed-lipped smile that never reached his eyes. I like to keep an eye on promising new talent. We have high expectations for you, Brandon. Keep up the good work. Brandon nodded reluctantly, feeling the weight of something unspoken pressing down on him. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Charles glanced down at the paper on his desk, signaling the end of the conversation. Good. You're dismissed. Brandon rose to his feet, his legs feeling unsteady, each step feeling like it took effort. As he placed his hand on the door handle, Charles's voice sounded again, halting him. Oh, Brandon, his heart pounded, his thoughts a chaotic whirlpool. If you need anything, my door is always open. Charles's tone was casual, but there was a hint of something undefined, a sense of surveillance Brandon couldn't quite shake. Yes, sir, Brandon replied, trying to steady his breathing, but inside, he felt as if a storm were building. The door closed softly behind him, yet it did nothing to quiet the thoughts churning in his mind. When the elevator arrived at the ground floor, Brandon felt each passing second stretch out, heavy and laden. He walked back into the bustling office, sounds filling the air, yet nothing could disperse the weight sitting heavily in his chest. It felt as though he'd missed something crucial. His mother had been right, there was something off about this place. And he couldn't shake the feeling. As the key turned in the lock, Brandon took a deep breath, the familiar lavender scent that Nia used to clean the house wrapping around him, offering a sense of calm. He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and stepped into the living room. Nia sat on the sofa, her book open, though her eyes never left him. How was today? She asked, her tone steady, but there was something in her gaze that made Brandon feel uneasy. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. The strange feeling of the day, the feeling of being noticed, of being singled out by Charles Henderson, was like a shadow following him. Fine, Brandon replied, forcing his voice to remain steady, though he could feel his pulse racing. Busy. Lots of reports, I'm still getting used to the company. Nia didn't respond immediately. She watched him intently, her eyes probing, as if trying to see beneath the surface. Did anything unusual happen? She asked, her voice lower now, as though she already sensed there was more to his day. Brandon stayed silent for a moment, unsure whether to share it all. But then, he bit his lip, unable to hold it in any longer. Actually, I met with Charles Henderson today. Her grip tightened on the book, her expression shifting. You met him? Her voice held a note of something that sounded almost as if she'd expected this. He called me up to his office. I'm not sure why. I mean, he's the CEO, why would he pay attention to a new hire like me? Nia didn't respond right away. Her gaze seemed to drift somewhere distant, as if she were caught in a memory. She looked away, but Brandon could sense the tension in every movement she made. He stepped closer, his voice softer. Mom, what's going on? Why are you reacting like this? Nia took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the scarf tightly, the creases on her face becoming more pronounced as she lifted her head. Her eyes, once full of life, were now wet and seemed weighed down by an invisible burden. "Brandon, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Brandon's heart clenched, every beat suddenly sharp and slow, as if he couldn't breathe. "What are you talking about, Mom?" Nia closed her eyes, a cold breath escaping her mouth as she inhaled, as if trying to buy herself more time. She then opened her eyes and looked deep into his. "Charles Henderson, he's not just your boss." Brandon froze, his eyes wide, his brow furrowed, his body stiff as if unable to believe what he was hearing. What is he?" Nia held his gaze, her own filled with regret and pain, as if every word she spoke was tearing her apart. "He's your father." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and the world seemed to stop. Brandon stood frozen, unable to blink, his mind spinning. "My father. Charles Henderson, he's my father?" His voice was almost a whisper, choked with disbelief. Nia nodded, her breathing shaky but firm. "Yes, Charles and I had a relationship long before you were born." Brandon shook his head, his hands clenched so tightly his nails nearly dug into his palms as he threw his hands in front of him. "But you said he left, you never said who he was, why didn't you tell me?" He stood up abruptly, his legs unsteady, his hair tousled from running his hands through it. "You kept this from me? You didn't think I deserved to know? I have a right to know who he is." Nia stood up with him, her hands tightening into fists, beads of cold sweat trickling down her forehead. "I just wanted to protect you, Brandon. I didn't want you to grow up knowing what kind of man he is, what kind of person he truly is." "What kind of person?" Brandon's voice cracked as anger and confusion rose up, choking him. "You didn't think I deserved to know?" The room seemed to shrink, the tension in the air stretching taut like a bowstring, ready to snap. Tears ran down Nia's cheeks, but she didn't look away. Her eyes remained locked on Brandon's, filled with pain but also resolve. "I didn't want you to be hurt," her voice cracked, each word like a dagger to the heart. "When I told Charles the first was pregnant, he kicked me out, cut off all contact with me. And when I tried to find work, he had me blacklisted from the industry. After that, I couldn't find a job, no income, no support. It was just you and me, and I had to fight to survive. He didn't care. He just wanted me to disappear from his life." Brandon stood motionless, each word from his mother like a punch to his face, a cold dread creeping into every corner of his body. "He did that?" His question came out strangled, unable to believe what he was hearing. Nia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, he had me fired. And there was nothing I could do but protect you from the truth." Brandon felt the ground beneath him crumbling. All these years, he had lived in the dark, unaware that everything he thought was true was now disintegrating. A wave of nausea rose in his throat as he thought of Charles Henderson, the man he had just worked with, now revealed to be his father. He realized that Charles hadn't just abandoned them, he had actively destroyed his mother's life. "I can't believe it," Brandon shook his head, his eyes wide in disbelief. "I worked for him, sat in his office like an ordinary employee. And all that time, he knew everything?" Nia sighed, her voice weak. "He didn't recognize you, Brandon. He didn't know. But that's not the point." Brandon shouted, his voice breaking with rage. "He left us, Mom. He ruined your life, and now I have to sit there, working for him like nothing ever happened?" Nia looked at him, her eyes filled with a pleading sorrow, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "I didn't tell you this so you'd hate him, son. I told you because I didn't want you walking into that place not knowing the truth. I didn't want you to get close to him just to be hurt again." Brandon took a deep breath, feeling as if the world was collapsing in on him, every part of his life shifting beyond recognition. He paced back and forth, slapping his hand against his face, his brow furrowed in turmoil. What am I supposed to do now? Confront him? Or quit my job? Nia placed her hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with concern. That's your choice, Brandon. But you need to think carefully. Charles is a powerful man. He could destroy you the same way he destroyed me. Brandon stared into his mother's eyes, the anger still smoldering in his chest, fueling his every move. I'm not afraid of him. He can't hurt me the way he hurt you. Nia sighed, her face etched with worry, her hands tightening as though trying to hold him back. I just want you to be safe, Brandon. He felt the weight of it all bearing down on him, as if everything in his life had shifted in a single moment. He looked at his mother, and suddenly everything felt too complicated to imagine. But one thing was certain, he couldn't keep working for Charles Henderson, he couldn't pretend like none of this had happened. I'll find a way, he said, his voice choking. But I can't keep working there. Not after everything I've learned. Nia nodded gently, her eyes softening just a little, though the worry never left. Whatever you decide, I'll always be here for you. Brandon sat down next to her, feeling a wave of emotions crash over him. The job he had once thought was a great opportunity now felt like nothing but a betrayal. The man he had once admired, his father, was now a stranger, someone who had caused more pain than he could ever have imagined. The sound of the subway reverberated beneath Brandon's feet like a mournful symphony. He stared out the window, his reflection distorted in the darkness, a silent reminder that everything he believed in had been erased. 2 days had passed since his mother had revealed the truth, 2 days since his world had been upended. He still couldn't grasp the idea that Charles Henderson was his father, the very man he had met on his first day at Henderson Enterprises. That man had looked at him as nothing more than an employee, unaware of the blood tie between them. And now, Brandon's chest tightened every time he thought of that conversation, each recollection stoking a fire of anger that gnawed at him from the inside. The man he had called father had destroyed his and his mother's lives. The train slowed. The screech of the wheels cutting through Brandon's spiraling thoughts. He inhaled deeply, trying to focus. He needed to clear his head before stepping into the office, he couldn't let anyone see how close he was to the edge. He wasn't ready for the confrontation. He wasn't ready for the decision that would change everything. The morning chill slapped his face as Brandon stepped off the train, merging into the sea of hurried commuters on the busy streets of Midtown. Ahead, the towering glass facade of Henderson Enterprises reflected the blinding city lights. Once, it had been a symbol of success, the place where he had dreamed of proving himself. Now, it felt like a prison, trapping him in a cruel game of which he hadn't even realized he was the pawn. The office buzzed with the usual noise as Brandon entered. Phones rang, conversations hummed, the click-clack of keyboards filled the air. Everyone was engrossed in their work, no one paying him any attention, which, in a way, was a relief. He needed space to think, to push aside the dark thoughts clouding his mind. But as soon as he sat down, everything he was trying to hold back surged forward. He opened his laptop, the cursor blinking on the screen, but his focus slipped away like sand through his fingers. Work no longer mattered, not when the truth had just shattered his reality. How could he sit here, pretending everything was normal? How could he continue working for a man who had abandoned him and his mother without a second thought? The worst part was that Charles didn't even remember him. Brandon had seen it in the man's eyes that first day, a fleeting recognition quickly dismissed. To Charles, he was just another faceless employee, a stranger lost in the crowd. The fact that Charles didn't know him only made his blood simmer with rage. He glanced over at the desk of Charles's assistant, who sat silently, the door to Charles's office closed as usual. Brandon could picture the man inside, cold and composed, running his empire, managing hundreds of employees, all while the dark truth of his past remained buried. But he couldn't let this continue. He couldn't let the truth be hidden any longer. He couldn't sit here, doing his job like nothing had changed, knowing exactly what lay beneath this building. Brandon began to consider his options. Should he march straight to Charles's office, confront him, lay everything bare in front of the company? He imagined the scene. Charles would be shocked, the truth would flood out like a tidal wave, but then what? Charles held the power, the influence. He could easily twist the narrative, just as he had with his mother, turning everything around and making Brandon the one who lost. He stared at the computer screen, but the words in the report blurred, drained of meaning. He couldn't act impulsively, not now. He had to be smart about this. The tension inside him tightened like a bowstring, every time he lifted his gaze, the unease paralyzing him. He glanced once more toward Charles's office, feeling a strange prickling sensation under his skin. Lunch passed by, but Brandon didn't even touch his food. Every thought of what to do next sent his mind spinning. He couldn't stay here, working for Charles, but he couldn't just walk away without confronting him. He needed answers, needed Charles to take responsibility. But how could he do that without losing everything? By the time the afternoon settled in, Brandon had made up his mind. He couldn't sit quietly anymore, letting everything fester. He had to confront Charles, but not here, not in this office, where every eye could be watching. Brandon stood up from his desk, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed a plan, a way to catch Charles off guard, somewhere outside the office, somewhere he couldn't control. As he gathered his things, an idea began to form. He remembered overhearing some of the senior employees talking about a dinner Charles was attending that evening. A fancy restaurant not far from the office, a place where he could flaunt his success, show off to important people. Brandon's fingers tightened around the strap of his bag. He knew what he had to do. Brandon's jaw clenched, a fierce resolve flooding through him. This would be his chance. He would go there, appear unexpectedly, and confront Charles right before the eyes of the people he cherished. He would force Charles to face the truth, to acknowledge what he had done to Nia, to Brandon. And he would do it in a place where Charles couldn't escape, couldn't hide behind the walls of his office. The plan was far from perfect, but at least it gave him a clear purpose, an outlet for the anger he had buried for so long. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let Charles continue to live a lie. The subway sped through the dark tunnels, the flickering lights on the ceiling reflecting the glint of resolve in Brandon's eyes. His hands were tight fists, trembling with the strain, but his mind was unwavering. He knew nothing was certain. Charles could push back, everything could fall apart, but Brandon no longer cared. He had to do this. He couldn't let Charles get away with it, not without facing the consequences. As Brandon entered the restaurant, everything unfolded as he had imagined, a luxurious space with large windows that let in a warm glow, diners absorbed in conversation and admiring glances. He paused outside for a moment, feeling the stillness before stepping in. His gaze swept the room, and almost immediately, he spotted Charles. The man sat near the window, beside his wife Emily and their son Ethan, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the storm approaching. Brandon's heart pounded, each beat tightening the coil of tension and anger within him. He walked in, not in a hurry, but every step seemed to press the air around him, forcing the room's noises into the background. Charles didn't notice him right away, still caught up in his conversation, but the moment their eyes met, everything stopped. Time seemed to freeze, the heavy silence palpable as the two locked gazes. Charles looked up, his face hardening, a mask of coldness, but Brandon saw a flicker of fear pass through his eyes. Silence enveloped them, no words exchanged, just the suffocating tension between them. The world outside seemed to fade, leaving only Brandon and Charles in a charged moment of past sins. Brandon stopped, standing across from the table, just one step away from Charles. The restaurant buzzed around him, but his mind was completely absorbed in the gravity of this moment. Everything outside felt trivial, distant, compared to the truth he was about to make Charles confront. His eyes were steely, a deep resolve emanating from him. I'm here for the same reason you are, Charles. Emily looked up sharply, her gaze piercing as she assessed him. Charles, who is this? Charles didn't change his expression, but there was something in his eyes that was beginning to crack. He cleared his throat, holding his glass of wine so tightly his fingers nearly trembled. Brandon is a new employee. A new employee? Emily repeated, her face showing disbelief. Her gaze flicked from Brandon to Charles, slowly piecing together that something wasn't right. Ethan stared at Brandon, his eyes full of suspicion and unspoken questions. Who is he, Dad? Brandon's grip on his hands tightened, a suffocating weight pressing on his chest. He felt Charles's gaze, burning into him like an unspoken plea for silence. But he had come too far to turn back. This isn't about work, Brandon said, his voice firm and clear. I'm here for something else, something that happened a long time ago. Charles's attempt to hide his anxiety failed, it was evident in the pale shade creeping over his face, in his cold eyes betraying his confusion. Not now, he insisted, trying to maintain composure. We can talk later. But Brandon refused to back down. I think now is the right time. The room fell silent. The world outside seemed to stop spinning. Brandon took a deep breath, his voice low but filled with a simmering rage. You know who I am, don't you? Charles didn't answer. He only clenched his jaw, eyes flashing. With fear, anger, or perhaps despair as he was cornered, no one could be sure. Charles, Brandon said, unwavering, his gaze unblinking. I'm not your new employee. I'm the son you abandoned. Emily's mouth dropped open, her hand frozen mid-air, her body consumed with confusion. Ethan, silent, looked from his father to Brandon, his face a mixture of shock and concern. Charles remained silent, the weight of the truth thickening the air. Words seemed incapable of breaking the heavy silence that enveloped the space. Brandon never took his eyes off Charles, and in that stillness, it was as if he could feel the man's entire world beginning to crumble, as the truth, unrelenting and undeniable, exposed him for who he truly was. Brandon took a step forward, refusing to break eye contact with Charles. His body tensed, every joint and muscle tight, his throat constricted. 24 years ago, you fired my mother, you blackballed her from the industry, left her with nothing, and then you walked away. Now, I'm working for you, while you sit there pretending like none of this ever happened. Emily, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief, let out a choked gasp. Charles, is this true? Ethan sat frozen, his face rigid, his eyes glued to the scene before him. He couldn't bring himself to speak. Charles stood motionless, no longer the powerful man he once was, but a stone statue, unable to respond or deny anything. Brandon caught the panic flickering in Charles's eyes, and though his anger still surged, there was a strange sense of relief creeping in. Perhaps it was pity for a man who had lived so long in lies. You ruined her life, Brandon continued, his voice softening but never losing its edge. You left us with nothing, and you thought you could keep going, as if nothing ever happened. Charles's face went pale, his hand gripping his glass so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He couldn't find the words. Brandon looked at him, finally seeing him not as the powerful CEO, but as a man backed into a corner, completely powerless in the face of the truth. Emily's voice, trembling, shattered the silence, each word like a knife cutting through the air. Charles, how could you do this? Her question hung in the space, cutting through the moment, freezing time as if the truth had weight enough to stop. Everything. Finally, Charles spoke, his voice hoarse, fragile like a weak breeze before the storm. I was wrong. I didn't think this would come back to me. His eyes darted around, but they couldn't escape the look of pure rage and pain in Brandon's. Brandon didn't let him get away with it. His tone was cold, slicing through the air like a sharp blade, but it has come back. Ethan stood up, his eyes blazing with fury, a fire so intense it seemed ready to burn everything in its path. He stared at his father, his voice rising in a piercing demand, "Dad, did you really do this? You have a son, and you never told us?" His words were like a scream in the thick, suffocating air, demanding an explanation Charles couldn't give. Charles's hand trembled as he set the glass down, his eyes darting between Brandon and his family, as if trapped in a corner with nowhere to escape. I thought it was all behind me. I didn't want to hurt anyone," he murmured, his voice full of fear and brokenness. Brandon shook his head, his voice bitter, as though the words were impossible to erase. "It never went away, Charles. You hurt my mother, you hurt me, and now you have to face it." The silence descended upon the restaurant like a thick, suffocating cloud. Laughter, clinking glasses, the soft murmur of conversations, all of it disappeared, leaving only the tension hanging heavy in the air. Emily couldn't hold back her tears anymore, and each drop fell silently, as if she were watching the man she had trusted crumble before her eyes. Ethan gripped the table, his knuckles turning white, like he was about to explode. Charles, eyes filled with remorse, looked back at Brandon, but this time there was no resistance, only the weight of a past he could not escape. The air felt still, the light from the chandelier stretching into long, dim streaks across the table, casting an eerie glow over the suffocating atmosphere. The world around them continued on, but the Henderson family's table was frozen, as if a storm was tearing through their hearts. Emily wiped away her tears, her voice tight with the pain of betrayal, each word a jagged wound. "You've been lying to me, lying to all of us all these years." The words fell like shards of broken glass, smashing the trust she had once held for him. Charles sat motionless, his face drained of color, his eyes blank as they stared into his glass, as though he didn't have the strength to face anyone. His hand shook, and the glass trembled in his grasp, as though everything he had built over the years was crumbling into dust. Ethan couldn't bear it any longer. He shot up from his seat, the chair scraping loudly across the tile floor, his voice dripping with disdain, filled with an anger that could no longer be contained. "So you protected yourself, letting everyone else suffer," he spat, his words laced with hatred. "You don't care about anyone but yourself. You only care about your reputation." Brandon stood there, his gaze never leaving the man he once thought unbeatable. Now, Charles sat there, small, weak, like a man on the verge of collapse under the weight of his own choices. Charles raised the glass to his lips, taking a long gulp, his eyes glazed, as if he no longer had the strength to confront the truth. Emily sighed again, shaking her head, her voice breaking, filled with a sob that seemed to choke her. "I trusted you, Charles. I built a life with you. How could you deceive me like this?" Her words cut through the air like a knife, striking at Charles's heart. The word "children" rang out, like thunder on a clear day. The truth slowly filled the space, oppressive and undeniable. Charles only looked down, his gaze filled with regret, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "I don't know how to explain," he whispered. "I thought if I buried it, everything would just go away. I only wanted to protect you." Emily let out a bitter laugh, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "Protect me from the truth? You protected no one, Charles. You only protected yourself." Her words felt like a fatal wound, and Charles seemed to lose whatever remaining hope he had left. Brandon stood there, hands clenched at his sides, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "You thought you could erase us, pretend we didn't exist. But we are here, Charles. And we've been living with the consequences of your decisions every single day." Charles lifted his head, eyes red with shame, but it was too late. The empire he had built couldn't shield him. Now, not when confronted with the years of pain Nia and Brandon had endured in silence. Ethan clenched his fists, his voice seething with fury, as though it could tear the air apart. "You lied to us, Dad. You built this perfect image, but it was all a lie, wasn't it? How many more secrets are there? How many others have you hurt? Charles simply shook his head, his voice trembling as he whispered, "There's no one else. I swear. Can we trust you?" Emily's voice was thick with tears, her eyes red from weeping. "For over 20 years, you've lied to me. I don't know who you are anymore." Her words fell like the final collapse of the life she thought she knew. Brandon felt a sharp pang in his chest as he watched Emily's pain unfold. She was the victim of this web of lies, just as he and his mother had been. But now, he couldn't find it in himself to pity her. There was too much she still didn't know. "You're not the only one he hurt." Brandon's voice was cold, but there was an undeniable bitterness under it, impossible to suppress. "My mother, Nia, she tried to stand up after he fired her. She tried to find work, but everywhere she went, she was turned away. He blackballed her, destroyed her reputation, and we've had to struggle through the years while he sat here living like nothing ever happened." Emily's face drained of color, the full weight of the truth finally beginning to settle in. She turned to Charles, her voice a whisper, barely audible, "Did you do this to her? Did you destroy her life just to protect yourself?" Charles set his glass down on the table, his hands shaking. His eyes were filled with regret. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said weakly, his voice cracking. "I'm scared, scared." Brandon's voice erupted, a sharp growl, cutting through the tension like fire. "Scared? That's your excuse?" Brandon's anger surged like a storm breaking loose, not only because of what Charles had done, but because of all the silent years his mother had endured. Charles's fear had taken everything, forcing his family into a prolonged, unending agony, with no way out. "You don't get to be scared," Brandon snapped, each word like a taut string ready to snap. "You didn't lose everything. We're the ones who lost." Charles raised his eyes, his gaze heavy, as though he finally understood the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. But his remorse felt hollow, a weak wave that couldn't wash away the damage he had done. "I'm sorry," Charles mumbled, but those words could never erase the wounds he had inflicted on their family. "Saying sorry doesn't change anything," Brandon responded coldly, brushing off the apology. "You can't just say sorry and expect everything to go back to the way it was." Charles opened his mouth, but Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. "Brandon's right," she said, her voice icy, a chill in the air. "You can't fix everything with just an apology." Her words were sharp as a jolt of electricity. "You've lied to us and destroyed their lives." Emily turned to Brandon, her pain impossible to hide in her eyes. Tears began to fall, silent but aching, as they traced paths down her cheeks. She spoke in a whisper, as though the words themselves could break her apart. "I'm sorry, Brandon. I didn't know. I didn't know about this." Brandon looked at her, his chest tight with the smoldering remnants of his anger, but he nodded slowly, each word feeling heavier than the last. "I know. This isn't your fault." Ethan, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke up, his voice thick with disbelief and helplessness. "So what now? What do we do with all of this? Is Dad just supposed to pretend like nothing happened?" Charles didn't respond. His gaze was fixed downward, his hands trembling, his lips pressed together in a tight line of silence. The man who once stood as untouchable now seemed like a hollow shell. "We can't pretend anymore," Emily sighed, her voice thick with sorrow as it caught in her throat. "We have to face the truth." Brandon's heart twisted painfully as he stared at Charles. The man who had caused his family so much anguish for years now sat there, unable to confront what he had done. The truth is finally out, Brandon thought, but there was no satisfaction in it, only a deep sense of emptiness and exhaustion. "I've said what needed to be said," Brandon declared, his voice stripped of rage, now cold and final. "Now it's up to you how you handle this." Emily's tears fell faster, each drop a silent witness to the pain her family had endured. Even Ethan, who had been filled with fury moments ago, seemed lost, unsure of what to do with the weight of everything. Charles's betrayal had shattered their family, and there was no mending it. Finally, Charles lifted his head, his voice weak and lacking any trace of pride. I will fix this. I will make it right. But Brandon shook his head, his gaze as sharp as a blade. You can't fix it, Charles. You can't undo what you've done. Brandon turned away, not sparing a glance, leaving Charles and his family to confront the truth, the pain that could never be healed. As he walked out of the restaurant, the heavy weight in his chest lifted a little, but the wound still lingered, raw and untouched. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Henderson Enterprises office felt suffocating. The usual small talk and professional exchanges had been replaced with hushed whispers, wary eyes constantly glancing toward Charles Henderson's office. Cracks were beginning to show around the man who had once been the embodiment of power. Brandon sat at his desk, eyes scanning the room, noticing how quickly the news had spread, faster than he had anticipated. What had started as whispers had now become open discussions. Charles Henderson is no longer untouchable, he thought, but instead of feeling any sense of victory, he only felt an unnamed sadness growing inside him. Brandon's phone vibrated, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his mother. How are you? He sighed deeply, unable to suppress the weariness that seeped into his words. It's all over. Everyone knows. A response came almost instantly. Are you okay? Brandon stared at the screen, his mind heavy. After a moment's hesitation, he replied, I guess. Just trying to figure out what happens next. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant, unfocused, staring towards the far end of the office, where Charles's door remained shut. No one had seen him come in this morning. Rumors had already begun to circulate. Some said he was hiding, others speculated that he was seeking a lawyer for protection. But whatever the case, the truth was out, and nothing could change that. At noon, Brandon's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message from his mother, but an email from the company. The subject line was simple, company announcement. Brandon's heartbeat quickened as he opened the email, each word seeping into his mind like a slow, steady poison. His chest tightened, as though a vice was squeezing the air out of him. The message was clear, sharp, and final. Dear team, effective immediately, Charles Henderson has resigned from his position as CEO of Henderson Enterprises. The board has appointed an interim CEO during this transition period. We are committed to maintaining the company's values and continuing to protect the reputation and legacy of the company. Thank you for your continued dedication during this time. His hand gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white, the cold weight of the message sinking deeper into his chest. It's over. The words echoed in his mind, but there was no relief, only an overwhelming void. Charles, the man who once had it all, now reduced to a name on an impersonal email. But why does it feel so empty? Brandon thought. There was no victory here, no sense of triumph, just a cold emptiness, as though the collapse of Charles could never fill the space left in his heart. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from the swirl of his thoughts. A message from his mother. I saw the news, are you okay? Brandon stared at the screen, his fingers still trembling slightly as he typed, each word heavy with unspoken feelings. Yeah, he's done. But it's not what I thought it would be. The reply came almost instantly, filled with warmth and concern. It won't be what you expect, Brandon. But you did what needed to be done. You faced him, and that's what matters. He closed his eyes, letting her words settle over him like a soft blanket. She was right, he had done what he needed to do. But even now, with the truth exposed, there was no satisfaction. The confrontation was over, but the consequences, the weight of them, still pressed heavily on his chest. By the afternoon, the atmosphere in the Henderson Enterprises office had grown suffocating. What had begun as whispers was now a constant buzz of open discussion. Brandon kept his head down, avoiding the curious eyes of his colleagues, focusing on his work, praying for the day to end. But as much as he tried to immerse himself in the tasks at hand, he knew that he couldn't escape the truth forever. A knock on the door jolted him upright, the sharp sound breaking through his thoughts. He looked up to see Ms. Taylor, his supervisor, standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, her posture rigid. "Can we talk for a moment?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying an undertone of something much more serious. Brandon nodded, the weariness in his bones heavy, and followed her to a small conference room at the back of the office. The room was quiet, the glass walls offering a view of the chaos unfolding outside. Ms. Taylor shut the door behind them, folding her arms across her chest as she leaned against the table. "Let's get started," she said, her tone firm yet patient. "I assume you've seen the news." Brandon nodded again, unsure of where this conversation would lead. "Yeah." Ms. Taylor studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp, probing. "I know you're involved with Charles." A cold shiver ran down Brandon's spine, a rush of panic flooding his chest. He hadn't expected her to confront him so directly. "You know?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Ms. Taylor nodded slowly, her voice low but steady. "The rumors spread fast. I don't know all the details, but people are talking." A sharp jolt of electricity seemed to surge through him at her words, his pulse racing. "What are they saying?" he asked, his throat tight, each syllable laced with dread. She sighed, rubbing her forehead as if searching for the right way to soften the blow. "They're saying you're his son. That the confrontation at the restaurant wasn't just personal." Brandon felt his stomach drop, the ground beneath him suddenly unstable. He hadn't thought about the implications of that, how the people at the restaurant might have heard, seen everything. Of course, the rumors would spread. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he muttered, his voice dropping as the weight of the situation settled in. I just needed to face him about what he did." Ms. Taylor gave him a sympathetic nod, her gaze softening. "I understand. I don't blame you. But you need to be careful. The company is going through a difficult time right now. With Charles stepping down, there's going to be a lot of attention. People will be watching you." Brandon swallowed hard, her words sinking into him, a dull heaviness pooling in his chest. "What are you trying to say?" She looked at him with a mix of concern and caution. "You'll have to decide. Do you stay here, work at the company your father built, knowing that there will be constant scrutiny? People will have questions. They'll want answers." Brandon felt as though the walls were closing in on him. He'd never considered this, he had been so focused on confronting Charles that he hadn't thought about the fallout. This company, once his father's empire, was no longer just a job, it was a battlefield. "You don't have to decide right now," Ms. Taylor added gently. "But think about it. Things are changing here, and you need to decide if you want to be part of that change." Brandon nodded slowly, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "I'll think about it." "Thanks, Ms. Taylor." She gave a small nod before leaving the room, closing the door quietly behind her. Brandon sat there alone, the silence wrapping around him as the gravity of her words sank in. When he left the office later that evening, the sun had set, and the streets were bathed in shadow. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. Charles was gone. But now, it was Brandon's turn to decide, could he stay at Henderson Enterprises, live under the shadow of his father's legacy, or was it time to walk away and find his own path? Brandon walked into the apartment, each step heavy as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. As soon as he dropped his bag on the table, his phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A message from his mother, "Come home, we'll face everything together." His eyes brightened slightly, and a faint smile touched his lips. The heavy feeling in his chest seemed to lift, even if just a little. Although everything had happened so suddenly and not how he'd imagined, at least here, in his mother's house, he could find some semblance of peace. He entered the kitchen, where the warm, familiar space surrounded him like a soft blanket in the cold. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, gentle yet enough to soothe his nerves. The quiet hum of the radio filled the room, playing like a comforting story, adding a sense of calm. Still, the worry didn't leave him, it clung to him like a shadow. Nia was standing at the stove with her back to him, stirring a pot of porridge. Silence hung in the air, as it always did. She didn't rush to speak. Brandon knew she was waiting for him to share what had happened, waiting for him to voice his thoughts. But he wasn't ready yet. He couldn't make a decision. At least here, within these four walls, the world didn't feel as overwhelming. Nia turned around, wiping her hands on a towel before meeting his gaze. "Do you want to talk about it?" Her voice was gentle, filled with concern. Brandon lifted his eyes, exhaustion and weight in his gaze. "He's gone. The company announced it," he replied in a low, almost lifeless tone. Nia looked at him with a soft, comforting expression. "I heard. Everyone's calling it a scandal." Brandon nodded, his hand clenching into a fist, nails digging into his palm, his body stiffening as if trying to hold back the flood of broken emotions. "It's not what I thought, Mom. I thought I'd feel relieved, maybe satisfied, but it's not like that." Nia placed her hand over his, a soft but firm gesture, as though to offer him strength, to anchor him. "You were right, Brandon. It's not just about him. It's everything we've been through. And no matter what he did, what happened can't be undone." Brandon looked at her hand, the deep lines etched into her skin, marks of a life filled with struggle and sacrifice. She had endured so much pain, so many burdens over the years. She had protected him, day in and day out. Now, even though Charles was gone, those scars remained. "I don't know what to do next," Brandon sighed, his voice light as a breeze. "Staying at the company doesn't feel right, but leaving. I'm not sure that's the answer either." Nia nodded, her gaze understanding. "You don't need to decide right away. You've already done the hardest thing. You faced him. You made him confront what he's done." Brandon closed his eyes, the memory of the confrontation playing vividly in his mind. "I keep thinking about those years, when I'd ask about Dad and you couldn't tell me the truth. Now I know, but this feeling, it doesn't feel worth everything I've had to endure." Nia looked at him softly, her hand tightening around his like she was passing on her strength. "But it was worth it, my love. No matter how painful, you deserve to know the truth. And now, you can live true to yourself." Brandon let out a long breath, his mother's words drifting through his mind like a soft wind, easing the storms inside him. She was right. The truth, no matter how it tore apart the image of the father he'd once trusted, was still the truth. And now, he could begin anew. "I just don't know where to go from here," Brandon whispered, his voice barely audible, like he didn't want to disturb the peace. Nia gripped his hand firmly, her touch warm and steady. "You're stronger than you think. You've already overcome so much, and now you can decide where your future leads. You can build the life you want. No one can stop you." Brandon looked into his mother's eyes, and for the first time in days, a glimmer of hope flickered within him. It was small, but it was something. "I understand now," he said quietly. "I can get through this." Nia smiled, her expression soft but filled with warmth, like a promise. "We all can." The day passed slowly, as if time itself wanted to give them a chance to heal. Brandon and his mother went about their tasks, cooking, cleaning, sharing simple stories. They didn't speak about Charles. They didn't speak of the past. For the first time in a long while, they felt the simplicity in each moment, the peace in the little things. That evening, as they sat together on the sofa, watching an old sitcom, Brandon looked at his mother and quietly asked the question he hadn't dared to ask all day: "Do you think we'll ever get real justice for what he did?" Nia remained focused on the screen, her face thoughtful, as if weighing her words carefully. "We've already had justice, in a way," she replied, her voice calm but resolute. Brandon furrowed his brow, confused. "What do you mean?" Nia turned to look at him, her gaze calm but firm. "Justice isn't always about punishment, Brandon. Sometimes, justice is surviving. Charles may have destroyed your mother's career, but he couldn't destroy her. She raised you, we survived, and now, we're stronger than ever." Brandon felt the strength in her words settle into his bones. They had survived, despite all the challenges Charles had thrown their way. They had weathered the storms, and here they were, standing tall. "Justice isn't just about watching him fall," Nia continued, her voice steady, almost like an affirmation. "Justice is that we're still standing." Brandon's throat tightened, emotions crashing over him. How much time had he spent thinking about retribution, about seeing Charles pay for everything? But now, sitting next to his mother, he realized that the true victory wasn't in watching the other person collapse, it was in the fact that they had made it through it all, no matter what had happened. "I think you're right," Brandon said softly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're still here." Nia took his hand, her eyes filled with pride and warmth. "And we'll always be here." The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the window, Brandon woke with a sense of relief unlike any he had felt before. Though the pain of the past still lingered in his mind, it no longer weighed him down like it had before. He stood in the kitchen, his hands steady as he brewed coffee, his eyes drifting to the window to watch the sunlight gently push away the remnants of the night. Everything outside was still, peaceful, as if the world itself was taking a moment to rest after the storm. As he poured coffee for himself and his mother, the rich, dark liquid fell into the mugs, the sound of it soft and comforting. Brandon paused for a moment, reflecting on the choices ahead. Henderson Enterprises might be a familiar path, but he couldn't deny that it was filled with too much of what he wanted to leave behind. It was Charles's legacy, not his. He needed to break free from the shadow of the past, to carve out a path of his own, one not bound by the weight of what his father had left behind. Nia entered the kitchen, still in her robe, her hair disheveled from just waking up. She looked at him with a gentle smile, like a beam of light in the quiet space. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm and filled with love. "Morning, Mom," Brandon replied, handing her a cup of coffee. A lightness settled in his chest, unfamiliar but welcome. They sat together. In the silence of the morning, the air around them holding still. Time seemed to slow, neither of them in a hurry to speak. There was a peace that enveloped them, as if they didn't need words to understand each other. After a long pause, Brandon broke the silence, his voice calm but resolute, like the first ripple across a still pond. "I think I'm going to leave Henderson Enterprises," he said, his tone steady but filled with conviction. Nia looked at him, her eyes filled with understanding and gentleness. She didn't rush to respond, but her gaze spoke volumes, a silent support that was unwavering. "You don't have to decide right now," she said softly, like she was comforting him. "I know," Brandon replied, taking a sip of his coffee. The warmth spread through him, almost as if he were absorbing all the good things life had to offer. "But I think it's the right decision. I can't keep working under the shadow of what he's done. I need to do something different, something that belongs to me." Nia nodded, a smile of quiet pride forming on her face. "I think that's a good decision." Brandon smiled, a small but hopeful smile. The feeling inside him was light, free. "Yeah, I think so too," he said, as if the weight of the world had suddenly lifted, and he was ready for what lay ahead. They sat there longer, no rush, speaking about the future and new possibilities. For the first time in years, Brandon felt a sense of control over his own life. The past lingered, a faint shadow in the distance, but now it no longer held the power to shape his future. He had faced his father, uncovered the truth, and now, he was free to build his own life, a life shaped by his own choices and decisions, not by the mistakes of others. As the sun climbed higher, casting its light on the space around them, Brandon turned to his mother, his heart full of gratitude and love. The years they had shared were far from easy, but now he could clearly feel the bond and the strength of that love. "We've made it through," he said, his voice soft but firm with truth, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Nia smiled back, her eyes filled with pride and boundless love. "Yes, we've made it through." In that moment, everything inside Brandon seemed to explode. The emotions he had kept bottled up, the struggles, the pain, the uncertainty, suddenly came rushing out in a wave. His chest tightened, as if his heart was swelling to twice its size. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter now, like something had lifted from his shoulders. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sense of relief that flooded him. The road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but with his mother by his side, he knew he could face it all.